Hello, everyone, and welcome to Glasgow Loves EU lockdown live stream. Tonight, we're really delighted to welcome Sir Vince Cable, and thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us. My name is, and also with us on the chat are Jenny Breslin and Bernd Poor. Jenny is monitoring that come in on Facebook or Twitter, so if you have some, then please put them up, and we'll try and get to them. And Bernd is making sure that all the technology works for us and recording the session for YouTube later. So Vince Cable hardly needs any introduction. You're well known as a former leader of the Liberal Democrats and Secretary of State for Business in the coalition government from 2010 to 2015, and more unusually amongst modern day politicians, you had a very varied career before being in Parliament, including a stint here in Glasgow as a Labour councillor, a lecturer at Glasgow University, and you also worked for the Kenyan government and as a newer chief economist for Shell. And you're also a very prolific author with a new book on world leaders and economics, and a forthcoming book on China. So, ask you about many things. Although our main interest is in our future relations with Europe and the wider domestic political scene. But before we get on to that, maybe you could kick us off by about your local connection with us here in Glasgow.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and congratulations to you for getting this group going. A really great grassroots initiative and something we all need, I think. My own involvement in Glasgow isn't just a sort of sentimental journey. It's how I first got involved 50 years ago in the European movement, because the first referendum debate was hotting up, and while I was a councillor in Glasgow, I was representing Maryhill. I used to go around central Scotland in debates, and the people on the other side of the debates, interestingly, it was mostly people who were then regarded as left Labour. So I debated against Robin Cook and Jim Sillars, who was then Labour also. And on my side of the argument, we had actually some Tories, CBI. But mostly, Strand in Labour, John Smith, who I subsequently worked with, George Thompson and others. So in a way, we're revisiting history, except of course that referendum went the other way.
Well, I mean, maybe we can sort of going back to the more recent referendum, and maybe asking you to reflect a bit on how we got to here in terms of Brexit. And back in June, you did an interview with the BBC. And June 2017, you did an interview with the BBC. You said that you thought that Brexit might never happen, once people saw the impact of it, and you also spoke at one of the People's Vote marches, saying, keep fighting, keep hoping, and we will win. So what went wrong, and do you think that the December 2019 election was the strategic error in terms of turning that around, or what were the factors?
Well, I think it was, but let me go back a bit. I think as far as the original 2016 referendum is concerned, I mean, there's been a lot of analysis. People have been wise after the event, and I don't want to go on about it at great length. I think that there has been a certain amount of myth making that this was, particularly seen in London and seen in English terms. I think it was seen as a revolt of the dispossessed, the left behind. I mean, we know that, in Scotland, that wasn't the case, because actually the strongest Remain votes were in, Glasgow, Dundee, areas of major deprivation. And similarly, in some of the English cities like Liverpool and Newcastle, it was, very deprived communities were pro-Europe in the referendum. I mean, the key determinant, actually, if you look at the statistics, was age. Very high correlation between Brexit support and age, and young people, heavily for Remain. And I think, this intergenerational aspect, which has been, reinforced in all kind of other ways, the COVID pandemic and which has major generational impact, I think is one of the big legacies of this, which will work out in ways we don't yet understand. In terms of where it all went wrong subsequently, I mean, we had a 3-year battle. I think until quite close to the end, there was a good prospect of getting a people's vote and actually turning this round. The government was completely unable to get the withdrawal agreement through Parliament. You remember Theresa May's traverse is this. Johnson was heading for the same problem. I think there were two things that were fairly crucial. One was that although we had a lot of support for a people's vote in Parliament, cross-party, there wasn't quite enough. It was about 5-10 votes short, something like that. So that wasn't going to happen. What could have happened, I think, is that when the Johnson legislation came before Parliament, there was enough support amongst rebel Conservatives and Labour people, as well as Lib Dems and the Nationalists, actually were in the same position on this one, to actually substantially amend it. We could have kept the customs union, I'm certain of that. But then there was this decision, which I'm afraid my party led, and the SNP as well, which was to push for an early election. It was disastrous because certainly in many parts of England, so the south of England, the large number of sort of Conservative people who were Remainers, that were so terrified of a Corbyn government that they went back home, as it were, politically. So the timing of the election was disastrous. The anti-Brexit parties were split, hopelessly split, whereas the Brexit people were, united, and that's actually what carried it. It's tragic, and some people unfortunately made bad mistakes, but it's now happened, and we've got to deal with the new world.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean that brings us on to the next issue. We've now got a deal, albeit a thin one, in the form of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and we also have the Northern Ireland Protocol of the withdrawal. So I mean, in broad, as a basis for future relations.
Sorry, you cut out. I don't know if it was my.
I'm sorry. So we now have a deal in terms of in the form of the Trade and Cooperation, and we have the Northern Ireland Protocol of the Withdrawal Agreement. In broad terms, make of the deal as a for future relations with Europe.
Well,
do you see it as something that can be built on, or an end point?
Well, I think it's got to be built on because it's so minimal. I think one of the unfortunate things that happened, and which contributed to the defeat of the Remain arguments, was that the government was very successful in deploying this argument that if you don't sign up to this, you're going to get, quote, no deal. I don't believe that was ever on the cards. It was never, it was never something they intended. It was almost certainly not primarily designed to frighten the European Union. They knew perfectly well what was going on, but it was designed to frighten the British public, and it succeeded. And people were persuaded, or many of them, that we'd actually got something, though it is so skeletal that it's hardly worthwhile. And I think that there's a particularly damaging effect of this, which we're only now beginning to see, that we've got so little in this agreement It actually puts Britain almost at the back of the queue in terms of non-EU countries, is that the government feels now it has nothing to lose. So it's now behaving very badly. It's sort of picking a fight with the European Union at every point, breaking international law, threatening not to cooperate, blaming the European Union every time something goes wrong, picking a fight about vaccines. I have to say the European Union has handled that quite badly. And we may, I mean, one of the unfortunate consequences of where we are is that I think this government is going to make Europe a kind of whipping boy, because there's so little in the agreement to conserve that they think they can just lash out in all directions. But if if we look at what's in it, I mean, there are a whole lot of things which have never been delivered. For manufacturing industry, which is probably the least badly affected, I mean, there is at least a rules of origin agreement, but already they are finding the big industrial companies, the car companies and aerospace and so on, are already finding that the amount of form filling with transaction in supply chains is massively costly and disruptive, and they're going to gradually leak away from the UK. The financial services industry, which of course is mainly London but also affects Edinburgh, has got nothing. Even the basic principle of equivalence hasn't been accepted. So, asset management companies, insurance companies, basically have no way into Europe. Quite a lot of them will export their business. We've just seen share trading disappearing in the last few weeks in European equities. We're beginning to see the consequences of lack of freedom of movement for professionals, creative artists, and you mentioned you had one coming to speak to you. I think that's something they just didn't think about. And so there's nothing there. You've got an enormous amount of costly form filling now going on, which is really hitting small, medium-sized companies. However people voted on the issue, then the anecdotes are beginning to come back through chambers of commerce and the small business federations about how much damage is being done to British exporters because of the mountain of red tape that exporters have got to transcend. And and particularly I mention this in Glasgow because you've got 3 universities, and the one I was at, which have been really badly hit. I mean, they've lost their research funding, they've lost their access to European staff. I mean, quite a lot of them are staying on for the time being on a legacy basis, but they're going to drift away and you're not going to get new ones. And this is going to be very costly and disruptive, and we're going to see this gradually seeping in. In terms of the cumulative effect of it all, I was never somebody who believed that leaving the European Union was going to be some catastrophic event. I mean, I think people like George Osborne did a lot of harm by exaggerating dramatizing the consequences, just as they did with the Scottish referendum. They thought they got away with it then, so they thought they'll do it here. And it was, it built up expectations that unless we have complete Armageddon, there's a great triumph. But it was never going to be like that. And the costs, which are very real, will gradually, mount up over time. And I suppose if you're a Brexiteer, you'll just not notice, or you pretend not to notice. And if you're a Remainer, it becomes a bit more difficult to point to the damage, because it's just sort of gradually cumulative effect. And I think that's what's already beginning to happen.
Yeah. Okay. I think Jenny, I think you've got some questions that have come in on Brexit and the deal through social media.
Yeah, so you were talking about age earlier and the difference between the generations. So we've actually got a question in about 17-year-olds. If they'd been allowed the vote, do you think the result would have been different?
Yes, I think not just 17-year-olds. I think it's 16 and 17. I think some of us have argued for votes at 16 rather than at 17. And I think if you take those two age cohorts together, that might well have been enough to tip it over the edge. And I mean, it seems to me all the arguments against letting young people vote have fallen by the wayside. I mean, I came up to Scotland to campaign in the independence referendum when young people did have the right to vote, and I was at polling stations where they were coming down in their school uniforms and coming in to vote, and it was a very mature, thoughtful process. And young people had their own dimension and their own way of looking at things, and the freedom to travel around Europe, to live, to travel, to tourism, to study. I mean, these are a valuable thing for young people, which we've now, of course, lost. And I think their participation could have well have made the difference.
Okay, I mean, maybe coming back to the notion that something that can be built on. What would be your priorities in terms of the things that need to be fixed?
Well, I think first of all, we've got to be careful that we don't diverge too much. I mean, that's where a lot of the technical debate's going to be, because there will be pressures from Brexiteers to diverge as much as possible. Now, the government has entered into undertakings not to diverge on sort of basic labour standards and environmental pollution, but you can see how easily that could be fudged. I mean, it was interesting. I think that the first regulation that they scrapped after Brexit was the restrictions on the pesticide, which affect the bee pollination. I mean, a really big issue if you're concerned with the workings of nature, but they slipped that through, and there'll be a lot of things like that happen. So I think the first requirement is that we stop divergence, because the further and further and further away we get, then the more difficult it becomes eventually to come back to something like the single market. In terms of what a change of government could achieve, I think straightforward re-entry is not a practical proposition, certainly in the short and medium term, quite apart from having a British government that would have the political courage to do it. I suspect the European Union wouldn't be keen. I mean, they've got this rather volatile, unpredictable member who's created a lot of bad blood. I very much doubt they would be rushing to have us back in again, at least on reasonable terms. But I think what we could aim to achieve would be a customs union arrangement. After all, I mean, even Turkey's got a customs union arrangement. It would be very valuable for manufacturing industry. Of course, it would inhibit Liz Truss and her department, who were going around negotiating trade agreements with the rest of the world. I mean, none of these are actually adding anything. I mean, they're mostly tiny variations on what we already had through the European Union. But the more and more we sign, it then becomes more and more difficult to get a common position with the European Union subsequently. So that would be the second, getting a customs union. And I think the third step, and the most radical, was to get us back into alignment with the single market, which a country like Norway has done. I mean, I've sort of memories of Norway, because when I was in Glasgow, there was a group of us who went off to Norway to encourage them to vote to join the European Union, because we were pretty confident we could get that through in the UK, and it was trying to get the Norwegians in as well. But then they said no. But what the Norwegians did was that they're very closely aligned to the European Union through the single market, and I mean that's more ambitious, but that would be the next step. So I think when we get a change of government, I think the big bold primary colours we're going to rejoin, I don't think was cut any ice, but there's a whole series of incremental things that we could be doing to prevent us getting further and further apart, and eventually bringing us together again.
I mean, I suppose that brings us on really to the next issue, which is our domestic politics and opposition. Now, obviously, we're still in the middle of a pandemic, and that quite focused everybody's attention and energies. And a lot of people are just bored by Brexit and want to hear anything more about it. But a lot of people also feel that the Lib Dems and Labour have been far too quiet on Brexit and haven't really been holding the government to account, and that has meant that the progressive political space, if you like, has been very much ceded to the SNP. So that charge, do you think that the Westminster opposition is missing, and is there scope for some kind of strategic progressive alliance at a future Westminster election?
Well, I think certainly to the second point, yes, and I'll explain why I think that's both feasible and necessary. But in terms of where the parties are at the moment, the Lib Dems may be quiet. Well, that's partly because we aren't getting a hearing. And it's part of the problem about only having 11, 12 MPs and not getting on the national news. And and I know Willie Rennie does his best in Scotland, but it's very hard to get traction. But I mean, the party's strongly pro-Europe. I mean, there's no ambiguity about it. And Keir Starmer, I think, has a genuinely difficult problem, and I feel for the guy. I mean, he's trying to avoid talking about Europe. This is why you don't hear from him. It's another different problem from the Lib Dems. And in Labour's case, it's self-censorship. And they have a genuine problem that their political base in the north of England is strongly Brexit. And on the other hand, London and the big cities, where they're also strong, Bristol, Manchester, are very pro-Remain. So in order to avoid inflaming divisions, Keir Starmer is just not saying anything about it. And that's, I can understand it, but of course it's not the long-term solution to the problem. You've got to be on one side or the other on this argument. So that's the dilemma. In terms of future elections and alliances, I'm all in favour of electoral alliances of the right kind. I mean, certainly before the last election, one of the things I'd done before I left the leadership was put together an agreement with the Green Party and the Welsh Nationalists. We had a bit more difficulty with the SNP. It's a trickier problem in Scotland, but we certainly worked with the Welsh Nationalists, and we had a seat sharing agreement with those other two parties. I think in future next general election it will be difficult to have a formal agreement. I mean, the British system makes it quite difficult, and there's quite a lot of bad blood, one has to say. So I think what might happen is a bit like 1997. Certainly how it worked in England, I think to a degree in Scotland as well, was that you got a kind of anti-Tory coalition working through tactical voting. And, where it's obvious that one party can defeat the Conservatives, which is the issue in England, whereas Scotland is more complicated, then, you just don't put in as much effort. And certainly there was this tacit understanding between Blair and Paddy Ashdown at that time. And I think something of that kind could be the way back. But it's partly because of the Scottish issue, it's more difficult this time.
Yeah.
I think something like that's got to happen. Otherwise,
so some kind of non-aggression pact rather than a kind of formal.
Exactly.
Okay, Jenny, I think you had some more questions through from social media, is that right?
Yeah, and there's a question in here about the deal. Do you agree that no deal outcome is still possible if Johnson digs his heels in over the Northern Ireland Protocol, and as a result, the EU Parliament postpones ratification of the TCI indefinitely?
Well, as I said earlier, I think it's not helpful to sort of wave this flag of no deal. In a way, it sort of helps the government, because they will argue that there's such dire consequences. Let's settle for something a little bit less, and they get a pat on the back. I mean, it's not I think a thought process to encourage. I would be very, very surprised if the European Parliament were to default on ratifying the agreement. I mean, if the French and Germans were sufficiently provoked, that Macron and Mrs. Merkel were to say, please, stop this agreement. We can't go on any further. But I can't see that happening. They've got an agreement. It avoids a lot of disruption. They've got other things they're worrying about, notably the pandemic, which is not going well in Europe. The last thing they want is another punch up over Brexit. So I think there would be no support for that kind of confrontation. So sadly, Lord Frost and his histrionics are going to continue because they think they can get away with it. I mean, what is embarrassing about it, of course, is that the British are in clear breach of international law, and we're sort of lecturing the Chinese. You mustn't break international law in Hong Kong, and then we're doing exactly that. I mean, it's just making the country look ridiculous, and of course the Chinese just laughing out the back of their heads.
Yeah, I mean that it's like brings us on to I mean how you see UK relations. And I think you wrote in the Independent last week about Lord Frost like a bull in a china shop over the way he's approaching things. But I mean, how do you see things in 5 or 10 years time, and when can we how can we get to some kind of like normalization of relations where it's not a purely sort of antagonistic affair?
Well, I would hope we would get to normalization a long way before 5 to 10 years. But for the reasons I've given, I think, unfortunately, the government has a sort of incentive to behave badly because they feel they've got, relatively little to lose. I mean, it's a sort of thin treaty. The European Union are not going to try and claw back the relatively small concessions they've given. So we'll continue to have this, verbal fisticuffs going on for quite some time. I would hope that maybe we get a change of prime minister before we get a change of government, and a more statesman-like approach will prevail. Because I think politeness matters. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's already apparent with the United States that in some ways, Biden's approach to problems like trade is no different from the Trump administration. But the fact that he's statesmanlike and courteous, and I think that matters a lot. And I think particularly with, the European countries, we speak different languages. Anger and discourtesy can be amplified because it's, nuance is lost in translation. I think a lot of good could simply be done by, having more statesmanlike, mature, grown-up conversations rather than shouting matches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jenny, did you had something else to ask? I think.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions in actually, but we'll just cut it down to this one. So a member of the audience wants to know what are your strongest emotions in relation to where the UK is now?
Well, I mean, I felt very deflated, as I think we all did when Brexit actually happened. I'd spent years as sort of one of the people fronting up the campaign, and when you don't succeed, you're living with defeat, and it's not good. But I suppose I'm intrinsically optimistic, and I'm arguing at the moment that, well, okay, they've got their Brexit. Let's look at one or two things that we might actually get out of it. Not because I think Brexit's a good idea, but because I don't want all the time to be defeatist and looking backward. And there are small things, in the regulatory front, dealing with data, in competition policy, having a more active competition markets authority, things like takeovers, where we'd have more freedom. I think, these are not big, and they don't do anything to offset the costs of Brexit, but we should be exploring them, and I try to be positive about it. And I suppose in the long run, I believe that the force of good economics, the change in generation, the younger generation coming through, this will eventually tip the balance back the other way, and we will come back. I mean, one of the things I learned from Nigel Farage, who I in a strange kind of way, because I was always debating with him. I suppose there's a bit of him I quite liked, and it was the fact that he never gave up. I mean, he was, I was debating with him 30 years ago about these issues, and he was regarded as a nutter and an eccentric and a hopeless cause, but he kept bashing away, and actually he got his way. And we've got to be equally persistent and have stamina, and so that's my emotions are a mixture of those different things.
Yeah. Hey, I mean, maybe the final question I had for you is a little bit linked to, I suppose, what you've just been saying, and it feels at the moment like aspects of public life in Britain seem quite fragile. You've mentioned how we resort to threats to break international law as part of our negotiating strategy, and there are, I think, quite deep concerns about the integrity of some political actors and some process. The unlawful prorogation of Parliament. We've got rather opaque through the pandemic and all sorts of accusations of cronyism. You've like grounds for optimism in terms of doing something about the economic or regulatory fine-tuning of post-Brexit. But I mean, is there other kind of like grounds for optimism in the more political sphere, and how do we get to a better place from where we seem to be at the moment?
Well, taking your basic argument, I mean, it is certainly true that British democracy is in a bad place, and we've got a House of Commons which isn't really representative of the country because of the voting system. They've got a landslide when in fact there was only a sort of narrow majority in the country. We've got a House of Lords, a second chamber that is frankly a joke. We have highly centralized government, certainly in England. Local government has been eviscerated, and we have a lot of sort of cronyism. We saw this with the award of contracts with COVID, but even before that, the donation system and the role of Russian oligarchs and so on. So I think what I would hope is that as part of the strategic approach to the next election, and parties working together tacitly, it isn't just done tactically, but that there is some principle behind it. And one of the key elements of that principle has to be a reform of the constitutional arrangements and the way that our democratic system works. I mean, in many ways it's broken, certainly at a UK level. And those are the elements, which need to be addressed within it.
But isn't that a little bit like trying to get turkeys to vote for Christmas?
Well, you could say that. I think it's possible that on electoral reform, which is of course the core, the Labour Party has always been a problem in the past because they've always taken the view that all we need to do is to sit around and we get our turn. But that's now much more difficult, partly because they've lost so much ground in Scotland. So if they're ever going to be a key part of the UK government, it will have to be on the basis of working with other parties. So I think the dynamic has changed, and the Turkeys are not necessarily voting for Christians. They may be voting for a free-range future if they agree to some radical change on constitutional matters.
Yeah, I feel an oven-ready deal pun.
Yes,
but I think it's probably best not to go there. Okay, well, I think our time's just about up. It's really been a pleasure to speak to you, and thanks very much for coming on to speak with us and share your thoughts. It's been great. Thank you.
And thank you, and keep up the good work.